Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. COW is a single purpose, single agenda, which is the first look at the 23-24 budget.
All right, good morning, council. So I hope you've all got the updated copies that Pam would have distributed just now. So there were a few small revisions made since we initially distributed that last week. Just to go through what you have in front of you, you'll have two documents. One of them is the presentation that I'll be going through today. The other one is what, in the end, when we get to approving the budget, will be the document that I'll be asking you to approve. It includes, sorry, if you flip over to the third or fourth page, it includes the rates. It includes a summary of the budget, and then for each department and each program area, it includes the budget numbers and details that you would be asked to approve. In a previous year, you would have seen a lot of that information included within the presentation itself. I've made the decision to break those apart to make it a little bit more manageable and you know, each thing to its own purpose, right?
And this is our first kick at the can, so we're not looking for too much.
Yeah.
I haven't think of it, so.
Yeah, there will need to be some discussion after I present this. This is not a final budget that I would even be able to ask you to approve today, and we'll get to the reasons why and how through the presentation. So I'm gonna go through this slideshow here. And I'll say up front that any of the numbers that are in here are based on assumptions of rates remaining relatively consistent. There's one exception, but I'll talk about each of those assumptions as we go through each section. And then at the end, there will be discussions about changes that you need your input on.
Yeah.
So start with page 3 in the presentation. You'll see a nice pie chart there for a breakdown of where our revenues come from.
So you're on the draft budget.
I'm on, yes,
He's on this page.
the landscape mode file. So here you can see that the single largest piece, of course, of our revenue is the residential property taxes, making up an estimated 43% of total revenues. And that is significantly larger than any of the other pieces that make up at most 10%, which is a combination of other property taxes and grants in lieu would be the next biggest at 10%. Services provided to other governments, area rates, solid waste collection rate, all in the 8 or 9% range, and then everything else there is a smaller piece of the pie, literally and figuratively. The next page is a similar breakdown of the total expenditures that are in the budget. Again, you can see the biggest piece here is the blue chunk, and that is non-discretionary spending, makes up 36% of our total expenditures in a year. That is broken up primarily. It's just over 50% of that is the school board contribution that we make. And then there are other pieces that go to the RCMP, remittance of taxes collected on behalf of others. That would be if we're collecting fire rates, we're collecting the village rate, and we're remitting that off to them. And then other provincial transfers, so libraries and other services the province bills us for. The next one below that is 20% of our costs go towards salaries and benefits, so direct people costs of the people who work for the organization. At 13%, we have budgeted transfers to reserves. So those are savings. It gets recognized as an expense in our operating fund.
Yeah.
And then below that, you'll see operating expenses and the various other categories of expense that we incur through our operations.
This is current expenditure.
This is for what is being presented to you today. So the budget for the 23-24 fiscal year. Okay. Although those percentages aren't going to fluctuate drastically year over year, they tend to stay relatively consistent. Yeah, you might see fluctuations of 1 or 2 in any direction, but they tend to be pretty consistent there. Of course, transfers to reserves can be one exception to that. If we have big or small, it might shift, but the rest of them stay fairly consistent. The next few pages, I've got some information here pulled from Property Valuation Services Corporation. Now, that's, of course, the organization that provides property assessment services for for everyone in Nova Scotia, and they are who provides the data upon which we tax residents and property owners on. There are 3 main types of properties: the residential, which again is the biggest piece of our tax base. The resource properties, which is a very, very small portion, and we tax at the same rate as our residential. And then commercial properties, which is in between the two, but significantly smaller than the residential category. And you can see where I pulled this info from and some more detail on each product, each property category there. The methods that PVSC uses to assess the valuation of property, they use a few different primary methods, which are presented here on page 6. The direct comparison approach is what is used primarily for the residential properties. It's based on recent sales of similar properties in the area, and they use that as a base to determine what the market value of a residential property is. The income approach is primarily used for income generating, revenue generating properties, so commercial properties. So based on their ability to generate revenue. And the cost approach, which is a much less common approach, it's when there aren't other direct comparisons. They would use a cost to replace a property and some assessment as to the value of the land that property is on. So the assessment values, as you may have known, have been going up quite rapidly in the last couple of years. So our residential properties this year, the total of all residential property assessments in the district has gone up to just over $1.9 billion for the 2023 year. That is up from just below 1.7 billion in the previous year. That represents a total 12.3% increase in the total assessed value of residential properties. The average value, the value of an average residential property in the municipality is $198,746. That is up 11.2% from the prior year. And the PVSC cap, so that's the maximum increase on taxable value that a property that is eligible for the cap would see, is 7.7%. Last year it was 5.4. Both of those numbers are historically high for that capped value. And 79.5% of all residential properties in Chester, in the municipality of Chester, are below that, or at or below that 7.7% increase for this year. I've included a little bar chart there so you can see the distribution of the range of increases that properties have seen, and you can see that by far the largest piece is the properties that have seen between a 5% and a 7.7% increase in their, right, that's indicating, I wouldn't say that 100% of those properties are capped, but vast majority of them would be. There could be some that aren't eligible and still only saw that increase, but they would be very few. Commercial properties, so we have a total combined assessment of $112,761,900. That is a 15.3% increase in total assessed value of commercial properties over the prior year. The average commercial property is assessed at $279,000, which is up about 11.0% from last year. And resource properties are total assessed value of just over 52 million, which is a 13.1% increase over the prior year. And the average resource property is valued at 22,742, which is a 10.3% increase. And of course, the PVSC cap does not apply to commercial or resource properties. That is purely a residential property. And now we get into what that means for our revenues. Now, of course, this assumes that we have left tax rates the same. There will be discussions on whether that is what we choose to do this year. However, for the purposes of this, we've assumed that rates are staying the same. So that's 0.7, that's 70.5 cents per $100 of assessed value on residential and resource. And it is $1.53 per $100 of assessed value on commercial. So the total residential property tax revenue is budgeted right now at just over 13.4 million. That is the same 12.3% increase that we saw in assessed value because of how those are related. And the average tax bill for residential would be $1,401, up $141 from prior year. However, the average tax bill on a capped property, so if you took the average property value from last year and applied an increase of 7.7%, you would see a $79 increase in that average tax bill to $1,272. And that's an average increase of, the average of properties that are increasing by 7.7 or less is that $79 increase for the annual tax bill, which is a 6.6% increase in taxes. On the commercial side, the current budget shows $1,725,257. That's an increase of 15.3% over last year. The average tax bill for commercial property has gone up 11% to $4,270. There are 404 commercial properties assessed in the municipality of Chester. 28% of those properties make up,
28 properties.
sorry, 28 properties make up 50% of the total increase in commercial taxes.
Those are the bigger ones, obviously.
Yeah, of those 28, 7 of them are actually properties that we grant a full or partial exemption of taxes to. And the other 21 are a mix of the larger retail and industrial properties around the municipality.
So that would be like shorthand.
I don't have the specific list in front of me, but it would be the larger, like the mall, the industrial facilities. I think the siding facility would be on there.
LP.
I could get a better list for you if you'd like to see that. But yeah, there are a number of new properties as well that make up some of the bigger gains, but of course, to go from 0 to something is a much bigger gain. And on resource properties, there are the total resource revenue is $366,842, with an average bill of $160, which is an increase of 15 over the prior year.
They're done good.
Yeah, they tend to be much smaller
Yeah.
bills for those properties. And so we've talked a bit about the cap. So each property is assessed at its market value, and then it also gets a taxable value if it's eligible for the cap, and that's where that's what we tax upon. However, I've done a bit of an analysis as to what it would look like if we were to tax on market values. So the total taxable assessed value for 2023 is that $1.9 billion I mentioned before. However, the total assessed market values of residential properties is just over $2.3 billion.
Without the cap.
That is it for the market values, right? Not the cap values. So at the current rate of 70.5 cents, we're budgeting for $13.4 million. To collect that same amount of revenue applied over the market values, our rate would be 0.5826. So that would be a 17.4% reduction in our residential tax rate to collect the same amount of revenue if we weren't under a cap system. Just a little bit of context as to how that.
So basically, if we're not under the cap system, the average person will be paying less. Is that correct?
I haven't done that full analysis.
Okay.
The average difference between market and assessed or market and taxable. So what this is saying is that
The tax
anyone
rate's
who's,
a good gap, but that's not necessarily.
Well, that's why, yeah.
so for anyone whose market value is less than 17% higher than their taxable value, yes, they would see a reduction in their tax rate. For properties where their market value is double their taxable value, they would see an increase in their tax bill.
You at your house, because you've been there for a long time, you would see an increase
Yeah.
in the amount you pay.
Yeah.
Person next to you that moved in a year ago,
Yeah.
they would see a reduction because you're paying more.
Yeah.
For sure.
And those, because when somebody buys a property, the cap is not eligible, they get
Unless it's
assessed at.
family, yeah, I
Yeah,
understand.
they get assessed that market. So someone who's purchased more recently is kind of already paying at that market rate. And so their bill would come down. However, these are all hypotheticals because we operate.
Capped automatically when they buy, but at a higher rate.
Yeah.
They get capped at whatever the first year after you buy it, you go back to a market assessment. And then from there forward, you'd be eligible for the cap, but on that new market assessment from when you bought.
Is it automatic or do they have to apply for it?
It's automatic. However, I know that they've made errors and people have had to let them know that, hey, I'm pretty sure you were supposed to cap my property. So we definitely encourage all residents to pay close attention to their assessments when they come out in January every year. A lot of people don't pay attention to those assessment notices until they get the tax bill, and the timing for appealing an assessment
So
is only 30 days. So by the time you get your tax bill, you've missed the chance to appeal that
Well, I
assessment.
thought the cap, unless I understood the cap wrong, I thought that the cap only applied if you sold your home to family, relative, brother, sister. No?
I'm not sure about all the exceptions. I know for someone who's just buying a house on the open market from an independent third party who previously owned it, they would not be eligible for the cap that first year. But then going forward, they would.
Okay, because my understanding was the only way the cap would be in place is if it was bought by a relative.
Yes.
That was my
Right.
understanding.
Well, if you own it, if you continue owning it, right, there's that. I think you're right, there
So
are
if I
exceptions.
sold it, Andre was my brother, and I sold it to Andre, he would still be within the cap.
It's
But if I
within
sold
the
it to
family. I
Yes, I think there are exceptions for that type
Sale
of thing.
of value, occasionally the cap is off accidentally, you can allude to that, that's why you gotta pay, we've had cases where it's come off, it shouldn't have. And they repeal the assessment, get it put back on again.
Okay.
So you
All right.
make-
And for example, if you've done improvements to your home, you may see increases in your assessed taxable value that are above the cap because they apply the cap, but then they would also account for the increased value from the
If you
improvements.
renovate, pay a piece on it, do something like that.
Yeah, if you expand or renovate or
Yeah,
make
that
anything
changes.
better about your property.
I think of you as a brother.
Okay, well,
Right, different mother and father.
Okay, Tina,
Okay,
we'll move off of that.
thank you. So going back 2 slides and still on the cap, so where it says 79.5% residential properties increased by, and it's discussing the cap stuff. So is that saying that about 80% of our residential properties
Our cap.
are capped?
Yes, there may be some properties that don't qualify for the cap that still only saw an increase of less than 7.7, but I would expect that I haven't looked through every one to see which ones are capped and not. So the vast majority of the ones that are seeing an increase of below or at 7.7% are almost certainly to be capped.
I did not know that.
That's a
About
big
80
piece of our
That's, yeah, I didn't know that. About 80% of
cap.
the residential population are capped, which is fine. I'm not saying anything good or bad. But if that discussion rears its ugly, if it comes up again around the movement to remove the cap, and I don't know where that is. I know some people in my community have asked me since I came out here and put it to the microphone that day, and they've not heard anything. 80%, that's a big amount of people that we'll hear from.
But some caps are more advantageous than others, because if you have your property a long time, you have a low cap, it hasn't changed. But as they move ahead, they lose the cap, and then the caps again going forward. So all caps aren't equal.
No,
Yeah, I really, I feel like not the debate of today, but you know, I really do have a problem with the cap, you know. Like you have 20% of the population just shouldering the more burden just because they happen to have moved to a house 3 doors down the street, you know, it makes no sense. It's not at all
you buy the
fair.
house next to me, same basic value as mine. You pay way more taxes than I do because you just bought it.
And you could have been in the community your whole life.
Yeah.
You know, it's,
well, it says right here,
Anyway, we can't change it, so.
the cap is removed for the year following the sale of the property unless it was purchased from a family member,
Yeah,
spouse, child, grandchild, or whatever. If the eligibility criteria are met, the calculation of the new owner's cap will begin the next year. So, okay, so that's basically what you said, I guess.
so I'll be able to get the cap. I buy
You can sell it.
so anyway, we can't change the cap, it has no impact on the budget. We can't change.
Thank you for that.
All right.
hypothetical.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah, some highlights of revenue for the budget, other than those tax revenues that we just discussed. So the deed transfer tax is budgeted at 2.2 million for the coming year. Again, we use a 3-year trailing average for that. I've rounded down to the nearest 100,000. Just the last couple of years have been large, so we want to be a little bit conservative there. And of course, the 50% of that is budgeted to be allocated to the newly created infrastructure development fund.
I remember it wasn't very many years ago, that used to be around 400,000 bucks.
It's gone up very quickly in the last few years, for sure.
But it may level out.
Oh,
because
yeah.
The
Always to
properties
give.
aren't selling for as much, they're saying the
Yeah,
prices
that
are
was-
coming down.
Yeah, it seems to be showing signs of slowing its rapid growth, but until I see it come down, I'm not going to say it's going to, because that's not my field. Yeah, landfill fees, we're budgeting at $3,186,000. That's down $283,000 from prior year, and that's primarily due to the way we calculate revenue under the sharing agreement. Solid waste area rate revenue is budgeted at $2,454,492. That's up $294,000 from last year, and that is based entirely on increased and assessed values. The gas tax, we're budgeting at the exact amount that we're expecting to receive this year, so $590,000 and change, which is relatively consistent, down slightly from the budget for last year. Sewer charges, we're budgeting $1,094,382. This is up from prior year, and this is the one rate that we've actually changed as an assumption for building this budget, and that is an assumption of an increase of 2% to $691.20 per EDU.
And that's to cover the costs of run assessment.
Yes, and we'll talk a little more about the sewer costs and projections later. Wind energy revenue is budgeted very consistently with last year at $1,454,950. And then we get into some expenditures discussions. So some more highlights.
Can I,
Yeah,
gas tax, so this is, we have a gas tax reserve that we keep for capital projects. Oftentimes at these conferences, you hear towns moaning and crying because they feel that they should be getting more gas tax than rurals, because they actually hold more of the infrastructure. The actual, if this is correct, there actually isn't that much revenue in gas tax. I mean, what are we talking about? $600,000? I mean,
And we're relatively restricted on what we can use it for too.
and that's all fine and good. And I recognize that if we were in the town of Lunenburg or whatever, they would have lots of things to use it on, but if they're getting even things like, if it's that kind of number, I mean, that's really,
It's not a very big number.
I mean, that's the cry you hear over and over. I never really looked at it carefully, but I'm really surprised at how low that number is.
I always thought it was higher.
it was higher a couple of years ago. They temporarily doubled it for a year.
Yeah, okay, that's why I'm
And
here,
it's
yeah,
because-
you don't have to go, yeah, okay.
And we use that for what?
Well, it has to be very specific in infrastructure type.
Trails.
It's capital expenditures, so recreation facilities, we've used it for some active transportation projects.
They changed
Wastewater,
Treatment plant.
water, we use it for J-class roads.
Is it in reserve now?
So it's a fair.
Yeah.
Well, and if you don't use it for the eligible costs, you need to set it aside in a reserve to ensure that it is used in future.
For that?
Some municipalities may decide that they'll save up a few years' worth for a big project coming. So, but it's capital expenditures that are capital,
They opened the envelope to rural internet a few years ago, did they not?
I believe.
Yeah, they did. They opened the
So,
envelope.
So yeah, we use some of that on the.
Yeah. It's very
You
restricted.
can't use it for any
For a
kind of
couple of years
operating expenses.
Right. Yeah, and this, I should say, this is reflected as a revenue in the operating fund, but it also then immediately gets transferred to reserves. So there's actually an equal and offsetting expense in the operating fund. It doesn't have a net impact. It doesn't affect the tax rate or anything like
No,
that.
you just can't use it for that.
Right, but it does get recognized as a revenue in the operating fund, and it's one of the larger single line items. So I mentioned it up here in the highlights section. So into some expenditures. So as you saw in the pie chart, obviously the salaries and wages and benefits are one of the biggest expenditures that we have here, that especially the biggest that we do have control over. The budget for this year for all of that combined is $6,097,199. That is broken down as shown here on the slide. So 211 for council and committees remuneration and benefits, 5.01 million for salaries and wages of staff. 113,000 has been budgeted for overtime across all departments. And employee benefits are at 951,000. Which of course is driven by wages. Those tend to be a percentage-based thing, CPP, EI, pension, that type of thing. We've also included a 3% allowance for vacancies, and that's $190,000 offset to expense. And I've added in here the projected actual vacancy savings this year are 3.95%, and the actual vacancy savings last year were 7.35%. And then there's a breakdown here by department and category for the increase that makes up that $5.01 million. So last year's budget, or sorry, this year, 22-23 budget was $4,315,394. And the 23-24 budget is $5,010,933. That is made up of some growth, which we will be talking, most of it you've already heard about, and we will be discussing it more as we get into the departmental sections of this presentation. There's an increase for the cost of living change that is as historically has been done, and under the policy, we've used the 12-month average of Nova Scotia all items consumer price index change, which this year is a 7.5% increase.
Wow.
There's also allocations for step increases, so people who are moving within the ranges as defined within our salaries bands. And then there's some other changes for things like turnover, reorgs, changes in allocation between departments, things like that. Some other expenditure highlights. So school board contributions is consistently our single largest expense. It is a non-discretionary expense. It is based on the uniform assessed values of properties, or uniform assessment values, I should say. This year's uniform assessment is up 8.8% over the prior year. So we will see. Yeah, so the school board contribution is up exactly 8.8% to $5,774,586. I should note that the uniform assessment values are actually lagging market assessments by a year. So what we're seeing here, that 8.8% really reflects the changes in assessments from this time last year. And so the even larger change we're seeing this year will likely come into that category next year.
So next year's budget's gonna go up straight pot.
So we're likely to see, like, I would expect more than $500,000 increase again in that next year, yes. Transfers to RCMP have been estimated at $2,237,707. We have not been given the exact increase to expect from the RCMP, so we have had to make estimates based on historical increases. To do so, if you recall, last year we had an 11% increase in that because the RCMP officers had negotiated a new contract. And so there was a large increase last year. I excluded that one from the historical analysis because it was the start of a new contract. The average of the 4 years before that was 2.4% per year. And so that's the number that we've used to estimate this one. Also with insurance premiums is another area where we have not been given explicit numbers from our providers. I have used that average CPI as an increase. That number may go up or down depending on when it comes back at renewal time. We expect to have that soon. However, of course, this piece, we're budgeting just over $250,000. So even if we're off by a bigger percentage there, it's not going to make a huge difference overall to the variance to budget. Transfers to reserves are budgeted this year at $3,740,668. That's up just under $17,000 from last year's budget. The general operating reserve makes up $807,000 of that. The infrastructure development fund is $1.1 million. And again, that's the 50% of the budgeted deed transfer tax. Both of those numbers will change as actuals come in. It will be 50% unless otherwise directed. Wind energy reserve transfer is $996,695. That is the net of the wind turbine operations, so revenue less expenses, plus the taxes received from the other wind farm, the South Canoe wind farm. Gas tax, you recognize that number from the discussion on revenues. That is the expense to recognize transferring that money into the gas tax reserve. We have contribution to the IT equipment reserve. That's a standard allocation that hasn't been changed in a few years. The parkland reserve contribution is budgeted at $8,000. That's up from $2,500 in previous years. This one is based entirely on kind of unpredictable subdivision fees that go into that. So as we get more of those fees come in, we have more revenue to put into that reserve. There's a budgeted allocation of $200,000 to the landfill equipment reserve, consistent with previous years. And there's a small sewer allocation of $3,728. And that is because the sewer program is sort of a self-funded program where any surplus or deficit is covered by sending to or drawing from the reserve. So that's the budgeted program surplus for the sewers. Now, a topic I've heard you discussing already this morning. Here's a list of the budget, of the grants that we have in the budget as it's built right now. So the budgeted grants are just a hair under $140,000, and you can see the breakdown of those on the right-hand side of this slide. There are operating grants for $33,000. The district grants are $10,000 per district. Recreation, $25,000. Youth sponsorship and leadership grants at $4,000 each. Economic development sponsorship, $6,000. And small capital, $25,000, and major capital,
What's
$225,000.
the total? Did you do that calculation?
That is, I've done it, it's 531 and change.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
Just
wrote
curious what we're gonna do.
I wrote it on my previous copy of this and
But
then
that's
fixed an error and
not what we're
reprinted
gonna
it.
do, because I mean, under major capital, we might have on this page 225, but we only have in the hopper right now, 151,373,87 in requests, right? So,
Yeah, I know, it fluctuates.
yeah,
When do we fight about this? Do we wait to the end?
deliberate.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, that's what I meant, deliberate.
Yeah,
yeah.
save your
We
fighting
wait.
for the end of the presentation.
Okay.
But Tim, just for clarity with council, I believe, that 225 includes 50,000 from, does it include?
Yes, there was a $50,000, so there was an approval last year for $100,000 that was to be broken over 2 years.
Right,
So 50,000 of that 225 was approved at this time last year.
yeah,
And also, I should clarify that those two capital categories are reserve funded. And so any change to that number is not going to make any change to the net budget or to the tax impact.
thank you.
And now we get into the section of the presentation where I'm going to ask my colleagues as the department heads from the other departments to walk through their individual sections.
All right, so the first one up is me. So for corporate and strategic management, the budget areas, the program areas that are included in this budget are the council program area, the CAO, or well, we call it CAO, it's actually now probably should be retitled to corporate and strategic management and CAO's office. The contingency budget, the policing and corrections, the REMO budget, fire protection, community health and housing, economic development, Kaiser Meadow Industrial Park, and the school board mandatory contributions. So just going through this at a high level, in the council program area, you'll see that the council grants are down from 2023. And I'm just gonna go over to my notes here. And you'll also see that there was some operating reductions in operating for council. And I think that was about a $20,000 reduction in operating costs. And that's mainly to reflect actuals in spending, so. The CAO program area, the major things to highlight there is that you will be seeing an RFD come forward in the upcoming weeks regarding a regional EDI, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. So you'll see that RFD and make a decision at that time whether or not we want to proceed with this, but in the budget, we've included the assumption that that initiative would go forward, and it's similar to the initiative that we do for accessibility on a regional level. So the proposal will be that we host a position, it's funded by our regional partners in part. And then there's some current EDI work that we're doing as well outside of the initiative. So you approved the action plan this morning, so there's some money in there to support some of that programming as well. And then, so that would be one of the growth positions that you saw was a regional EDI coordinator, but just so you understand that that's a regional position and there would be offsetting revenue for that position as well. And then you've already approved the creation of a policy intern or a policy analyst position. So you're seeing that reflected in here. You're also seeing the change in the strategic initiatives coordinator position, so that's out of this program area now. It'll be moved over into the infrastructure and operations, so some of that is that move. We're continuing to focus on our EDI and accessibility and the safety program. And in particular with the safety program, there's an increased focus on mental well-being and wellness for staff. And then you also see in there the completion of the personnel policy and the salary and benefits review. Moving into the contingency and following up on that last comment, you're seeing a 3% vacancy factor for salary and wages in this budget. As well, there's an amount set aside in there. So each budget area, you're seeing increases for that 7.5% for cost of living for wages. But there's also the outstanding adjustment of our salary bands and our and the salary and benefits review piece of that. So there's some contingency set aside in here, and I think we 350,000, I think it is.
No, but
Is
I
that-
do have some
am I
more
wrong?
information on that to present a
Okay.
little bit later.
All right.
And,
So we'll present it later, but there's some contingency in there for
Depending on
that,
where we go.
depending on where we're going. So no decision on that, but we'll have further discussions on it, but there's some contingency in there. And there's also unanticipated operating costs of 50K. So we usually make sure that there's some contingency there for operating costs. The policing and corrections, Tim already went over. So last year, we had seen a new contract with an 11% increase. So you're seeing an average this year, a 4-year average excluding last year. And so there's 2.4% allowed for the increase in the RCMP contract. Remo, you've already approved the Remo operating budget for our shared participation in Remo, which had a $7,000 increase for that area. And then we've also added back in the $20,000 for the water distribution program as a contingency. Staff continue to work on the community well initiative, but in case that's not ready for this year, there's money included in the budget to do that. Last year we had taken it out, and so we ended up doing the program and then going over budget in that, so we put it back in the budget for this year just in case we need it. Until we are sure that that program's up and running. Fire protection, pretty status quo. There'll be some increases, but that's essentially money that's coming in and out. With as well some increases for wages and salaries for the fire service coordinator. Under the health and housing, that one's a non-discretionary budget item. So that's the funding of the housing, the community housing, public housing. And then economic development. So what you see in there is that the team is going to be leading discussions on the growth plan. And that'll encompass workforce and attraction and infrastructure, community planning and recreation planning. So you had a presentation on that last week. Development of a program for foreign direct investment and a video signage and a pitch book. So there's already been some funding approved for that one. So we're getting that one half funded. So that is foreign direct investment. And then we continue the work on the arts culture strategy. And then in there, you're also seeing that some of the operating budget that we had for the industrial park, the Kaiser Meadow Industrial Park, we've taken it out of the economic development budget and put it into what used to be the Eco Park budget. Now we're calling it the Kaiser Meadow Industrial Park budget. So we've just separated that out. It's no longer showing in economic development. It's showing in the Kaiser Meadow Industrial Park budget. You also see in there that we removed $128,000 that was earmarked for the broadband project. So because we did not move forward and we can't give the grants to the individuals, and Develop Nova Scotia came forward with the project for internet for the people who are already served. We've taken that $128,000 out of there. And then for the Kaiser Meadow Industrial Park, you're seeing $130,000 was in the budget in 22-23 for engineering. That's been removed, and then we've added in those operating expenses and the marketing pieces of that. And the rest of it is the school board mandatory contributions, which Tim already went over. So that's it for my department.
Okay.
Chad.
So for our community development and recreation services, we have everything, all the various services that we list there. And as well on the note of the growth position. So just to recall your memories at the administrative assistant, the building official level 1, and the building official trainee positions were all approved back in our discussion earlier this year when we decided not to proceed with the shared services model. And so I think most of you would have received a note that we have filled the trainee position already. We have not been successful in the level 1 building official. We have a big goose egg in terms of applications for that one right now. So still lots of challenges in trying to
start.
building official. It is a good start.
It's a start.
It is, yeah,
Here,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. And we will be recruiting very shortly, maybe as early as next week for that administrative assistant position. And lastly, on the growth position, so the summer student trails ×2. So if you recall, as part of our open space plan, we've been working through that and developing our new trails on our GEM properties. And so a lot of that trail work was completed this year. And so we're going to be moving into maintenance phase once those trails open up, and we'll probably have some type of grand opening this spring. And then so there's additional requirements for inspection and maintenance of those trails. And so we're looking to accomplish that through students and using students to do that. And for this initial year, we've actually have found a funding stream through the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. We've applied for 100% coverage of those 2 students. So that'd be great for this year moving forward, or if we're not successful with those applications this year, that will be something that we'll be looking to continue to fund into the future, just because of the additional trails that we have and the requirements for the maintenance and inspection of those trails. Yeah. So on the next slide, I'll run through a few items from our program area. So with animal control, we're into year 3 of our contract for animal control. So no real change there, and our numbers are consistent throughout that 5 years of that contract. So no change there. For bylaw, so again, we are going to have some changes with our bylaw. So currently that is a 60% cover position, and that 60% will carry forward into the new year. But if you recall the change, so currently staff member doing that is transitioning into full-time fire inspection, and so that is going to be a position that we do have to backfill once that transition happens into the new fiscal year. And I think Manny's going to talk a little bit about this section around remaining 40% of potentially of that position. So we'll talk about that shortly. Under building inspection, so I guess again that's just a review of no real change except for the positions that we just talked about. So other than that, we're not anticipating any significant changes to our building inspection services.
But you budgeted for the new person.
Yes. We have, yes, that is included in there. Yes. Under fire inspection, again, that is the change in there is that it appears as though there's a additional salary in there, but it's essentially just a change in the budget. So formally that some of that fire inspection would have been captured under shared services agreement where we were paying somebody else for that cost as opposed to salary. So that will be going into full-time into fire inspection. And again, under fire inspection, there's still some catching up to do in terms of re-inspections that are required through our system of fire inspection policy that we have set up. So we'll continue to work. There's been some really good work over the last number of months to catch up on those re-inspections, as well to catch any facilities that have not had inspections in the past, and of course any new inspections. And so a lot of those numbers you see on a regular basis on the quarterly reports.
So Chad, will our current bylaw officer transitioning into fire inspection, will he still be doing some bylaw stuff as well, or strictly fire?
We'll work out some of those details. I believe probably strictly fire, but we'll see how that all works out.
Yeah.
Under planning, there's a note there, just higher open space revenues. Again, that's basically just speculation, just based on kind of what we've seen in the last few years, what we may anticipate for the upcoming year. And we do have some funding in there for water quality monitoring, and there will be a few different, there's gonna be at least 3 reports coming to you in the next little while. So I've seen a draft report from Coastal Action, the Sherbrooke Lake Water Quality Monitoring Program. We also received the report that Garth is meeting with the Fox Lake Committee, so that report is in. We'll be talking about that one. And then we also, if you recall, we added Stanford Lake onto that, so we'll have that report is now received, that will be coming forward to you. And then lastly, as far as water quality monitoring, is that one of the things that council requests is that we take a little bit of a new approach in looking at how we're handling water quality monitoring. And so that funding is in there that just as a placeholder, depending on what council chooses as kind of a next steps on where we may go with water quality monitoring. And so there's some that's essentially to give you some options to determine where you want to go with that. So anyway, all that will be coming back to council in the next couple of months, and some shorter. And the only other thing to mention in planning is just, I guess, from a highlight perspective, is that village plan review, of course, continues to be a priority, and balancing that with the other any other applications that come in, whether it's for a rezone, like we discussed earlier this morning, or new DAs and those types of things. So we're working to balance that work. In recreation, not a lot to report in there, other than we are continuing to proceed with the plan for our open space, and we will continue with a few of those final touches on some of those properties where we have new trails. We're just working now on some of the signage and some of the other amenities, so that will be finished up, and we'll have some grand openings this spring. And the next property that's on the list is, of course, Mullen Point, and so we'll be looking at that one as our accessible park, if you will, as we're working on the implementation of that this year as well. And nothing really to report on the heritage and heritage properties and library. So I think that about covers everything that's in the categories, unless anybody has any questions on those.
So before Chad gets into this next step of talking about capital stuff, I think I'd just give a little bit of an overview of how capital is presented here to you this year. As I mentioned at the start, there is this document that will be the approved budget eventually. The last 2 pages of that include the 5-year budget. So the second last page is the proposed 23-24 budget, and then the following 5 years are on the next page. The vast majority of what you'll see there are things that you've already approved back on February 9th, I believe. And there are a small handful of items that were approved for the 22-23 budget, but weren't quite completed and need to be reflected and will be carried forward. Each of the departments will have, so as you see here, there's a slide for anything that doesn't fall in those 2 categories. So new things that you have not seen yet or have not approved yet. And there will be a list in each section as to the projects that are included in the capital budget that are already approved, as well as any that are just simple carry forwards from the current year. So.
Okay, so following that, this is one item that was not in the list of the original capital budgets, and that is related to our uniform signage project. So if you recall, council gave some direction that we want to expand our uniform signage project to the other exits, Highway 103 exits. And so one of the things that we want to do before we get into doing that is to get the current one correct. And so we didn't quite get it right the first time, and so we wanted to make some changes. And one of those items is the post that these signs are installed on. So the signs ended up being a fair amount heavier than we had anticipated, and the height is a little bit higher than we had anticipated as well. And so the current posts, so the image is a little deceiving there. So they're actually mounted on 2-inch telespar posts, and there's a nice decorative covering around them to make them look nice. So the 2-inch telespar we found just isn't sturdy enough to handle the signage that we have installed. And so the suggestion, working with our public works staff, was to look at a round aluminum post to replace these ones. So all the rest of the everything that the rest of the sign is good and is reusable. It's just the posts that need to be updated, and they would be installed on a concrete base to make sure that they were secure. And while we're doing that, there are a couple of signs where there were some problems. That one was blocking a little bit of a view from a particular person's driveway, and they requested a slight change of location, and a second one as well. So at the same time we do that, we will be able to make any of those adjustments as well.
What was the height of the sign? I can't remember roughly.
I can't recall, each one of those is about 16 inches, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I can't remember, but we were getting up to about probably 16, 18 feet, 20 feet, at the top part there, so. Yeah,
Too
so they're
high.
tall, yeah, and so that was when we ran into some of the issues initially. We thought that perhaps our public works staff could do some of the installation. You can't install that type of a sign with a ladder, and so we needed to go to a sign installation company or somebody with a bucket truck in order to do that work. And then, of course, we had some challenges trying to secure a company to do that, so.
I don't know if there's a requirement for just a highway sign, but normally, like, for example, if the sign were in front of a, say, commercial property, generally those signs would be engineered. Is there any engineering in this, or are we just gonna make a stab at what we think is gonna work out?
So
Usually they have cantilever footings and like it's.
yeah, so that,
to prevent
so,
overturning.
yeah, so I can't speak in detail to that. Our public works staff are looking after that, but I know they've taken that into consideration. They are talking about, concrete footings and that type of thing to ensure that they're installed properly, and that they're gonna last into the future. So, so if there were some more detailed questions, I can chat with public works about some details. But I know that so for example, the 10-inch aluminum posts they've been working with our partners at Nova Scotia Public Works for those. So
That makes sense.
so yeah, so that's where they would be coming from. And then I guess the following slide are those items that were already approved in the capital budget. So that's just a listing of all those existing projects that fall under community development and recreation.
Yeah.
Okay, so to continue with infrastructure and operations, and just to expand a little on the position that's currently 100% bylaw, what we're proposing is to keep that position. So this is not a new position, but to have it split 60% bylaw and 40% as what we've termed as a waste inspector. It's a very similar role, but 40% that would concern infrastructure and operations would deal with issues with flag tipping, issues with community bins, education, distribution of not garbage cans, green bins for composting, things like that, so that it's we're dealing with, we have somebody specific to deal with waste related issues, as opposed to just relying on the finite resources with bylaw, which, as we all know, is stretched. So we're trying to tap into that as an expansion of duties of that role, that's specific to Chad's team and then to infrastructure and operations. So that's the theory behind that. Going into the summary. Really, very broadly speaking, and I won't go through all of these, but the general overview is that there are higher costs, but there are higher revenues. Unfortunately, the costs do outstrip the revenues somewhat, to the tune of sort of $466,000, and that's CPI steps. We've got the salary increases that Tim's alluded to as well. So if you happy to discuss those further, but it's fairly self-explanatory. I don't want to belabor the issue. In terms of new asks, so you're already aware that we are well underway with the design of the phase 2 of the leachate treatment plant at the landfill. We're due to receive those designs back at the end of this month. And when we receive those, we'll have a much firmer detailed cost estimate of that work. We've put in a $2 million estimated cost at the moment as a placeholder. Hopefully we're not too far off, but we'll certainly be able to confirm that in the next 2 or 3 weeks when we get those designs. In terms of the construction, we will be looking to get that constructed this year, obviously with the budget allocation. Moving on to the wastewater system renewal.
Sorry, if I could ask a
Yes,
question,
of
sorry.
course.
So looking at municipal properties, and I might have missed it in the. budget
Sorry, yes.
somewhere. Is there anything allocated in the budget for the walkways at Wild Rose Park?
I think yes, I'm going to say yes.
Okay, 'cause I wasn't sure.
No, because that's a conversation I've had with Tammy, who's looking at this particular thing. There is, I don't know what that number is,
That's okay.
but we have had that discussion and it's on our radar to deal with, imminently. So it's not that it's not on our list of things to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Milk Holes, there's temporary speed bumps. And 2 or 3 years ago, it was in our budget to have those in place with permanent ones, and it's got lost somewhere over the last couple of years, but they're supposed to be pavement and less intrusive and permanent. And I was just wondering if you found that anywhere in your documentation, because it was in there 2 or 3 years ago. And
I haven't, but I can certainly add it to the list.
And they're supposed to be what they talked about with the less intrusive ones, they're longer and they're pavement and they're permanent.
Yeah, I know the ones.
Those are Daniel Park?
Yeah.
Okay, where we actually own the roads.
Yeah, it's nothing we're aware of, but absolutely, we should put that on the list there, no problem. Wouldn't temporary ones be better? No, because you want them.
Well, they're taken out, and then the school area, they still guys ask the kids, but they take them out all winter, so no.
Because a lot of those temporary ones are temporary because you don't want them interfering with snow plowing.
I know the cement ones are less intrusive.
Okay.
And they're.
But they're permanent.
Well, the school is right there, and it slows the cars down to the school too, so, and the residents were the ones that asked for it, I didn't even know they were going in at the time, but the kids playing the road, they shouldn't have.
So we're gonna do with your temporary ones that you're not gonna use anymore.
Can I give them to you?
Give them to the judge. No, not mine, it's all public works.
Free speech.
Okay, we'll find a place for them.
Yeah.
There's they'll let you pull them out. Anyway,
Ask forgiveness later. Anyway, just
keep going.
don't throw them out.
We get a lot of
Don't
stuff.
throw them out. Okay, so sorry, I mentioned the treatment plant. Was there any questions on the treatment plant, or is that? This is been through it before. Wastewater system renewal. So basically, there's 3 parts to this, none of which is new to you. It's all been already discussed, but there's the expansion of the collection around Stanford Lake. There's 3 upgrade to 3 pumping stations, and then the upgrade to the Chester wastewater treatment plant. Construction timelines, so these have already been distributed to CBCL, and we are aiming to have construction tender going out sort of April, May, or the very earliest opportunity, because we want to get these moving. The construction timelines will be determined by the scope of that work. If it's upgrades, they may not be. They may be quicker to achieve. If it's more extensive reconstruction work, then obviously we have to factor that in, and that may spill into the following years. But we hope not. But we'll at the end of this month when we receive the CBCL report. Sorry, not the end of the month, the Q1. So that's. I'm sorry, just to clarify as well. So the total that you see in the budget of 8.3 million, we're only projected to spend a shade over 2 million for these projects. It's a multi-year funding stream, so we're basically splitting it into quarters. So this is the first year's batch, if you will, that constitutes 2 million.
Yeah, and you'll see, as you will with other capital projects that were brought in September last year, and probably around the same time this year, I'll bring you an update after year end to say, here's how much we've spent of this project, and the remaining amount will be carried forward into the following year. That same thing will apply to this project for sure.
Just the final slide is just a summary of the approved capital on the 9th. So landfill approved capital total is 840,000. Sewers adds up to 612. Municipal properties is 187. thousand plus the 50 for the zero turn mower and the welcome signs. So that the approved capital is just short of $1.7 million. The leachate and the wastewater projects, they add up to 2.55 million for a grand total of $4.25 million worth of capital work for this coming financial year with infrastructure and operations.
Now we're back to my turn. So, unless there are any further questions for Manny.
I'll just say, are we gonna get a chance to dig into the landfill and how that whole, because we've been talking about the financial model for exactly how.
Well, Manny's supposed to be bringing that.
Yes.
At some.
So we will, both Tim and I will be bringing that sort of report and recommend, well, suppose the recommendations in the first half of April. So that is coming to you. We wanted to get the budget out of the way so we could focus on that and with a clean slate and take that.
There's also a little bit for discussion in closed session later today.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, so Financial Information Services Department, that is under the direction of Tim Topping. There's a list of my program areas there in Financial Information Services. Really, that's a lot of financial stuff, taxes, grants, transfers to and from revenue, from reserves. And then the real departments where people exist, finance and IT. At a high level, primarily the changes are related to salary and wage changes, increases there, which we've already discussed a couple times. And then changes to taxes that we talked about, transfer tax, and then the transfers to reserves that we have spoken of already and will further discuss. A couple of capital items that are being included in the information services program this year. One is for council chambers audio visual upgrades. So that is with the intent of taking our temporary OWL service to a more permanent and more user-friendly and robust. This is sort of a cross-departmental, as both of the capital projects I'll be discussing are, where the manager responsible for signing off on expenditures will be Cliff Gall. And so we're putting it under IT. However, it's being done with, of course, the support and direction and assistance of Tara here to support the council program area. So it's a cross-functional service. So this will improve the video feed to give higher quality for participants both inside and outside of chambers, improve flexibility for streaming across multiple platforms, ease of use and just simplicity and less problems that pop up.
Can we get earbuds for Della?
As well as accessibility issues.
Yes.
So for accessible hearing options was actually the next item on the list there. For the public during meetings, I'm sure we could make that available for counselors as well as the support for a live interpreter for ASL, if that were something that we chose to do in the future. The estimated cost of these upgrades is at $115,000. That would be funded from the operating reserve. And the expected timing would be in the first quarter of the coming year. You will see an RFP come back to you with the scope and selection of supplier. So this will be back to your.
And I'm sure that it'll be done in accordance to the new accessibility regulations. I mean, if you're gonna put a system in, you maybe make sure that.
Yeah, it definitely, with the thought process, it definitely includes the ability to increase the accessible functions of the audiovisual services.
Because we're gonna have to do it eventually.
Yeah. The next capital project that's included here is, again, another cross-functional capital project where it's primarily supporting the infrastructure and operations group in their asset management program and work. However, again, because the purchasing is IT equipment and will be managed under Cliff's group, you'll see the budget here under IT. So this is for GIS equipment upgrades. So for the current and future priorities in asset management and infrastructure installations, we're looking to purchase 3 new GPS receivers to be available for staff in the GIS area to deal with asset data collection. So it offers a higher level of accuracy when locating assets, as well as guidance for land and asset management activities. And these units will provide sub-meter accuracy, so they're accurate to less than a meter of distance. The estimated costs for these upgrades are $35,000, also to be funded from the operating reserve, with the purchase expected to occur in Q1. And this one, if approved at the end of the budget process this month, would likely not come back to you for further detail. The next couple slides are on transfers to and from reserves, so just a summary of the different reserve transfers. The first one here is transfers from reserves, so this would be revenues to the operating fund. So the first is transfers from operating reserves. These are items that are not ongoing recurring items in the operating budget, and so it doesn't, it's not the most appropriate to fund through the general rate. We would fund these from operating reserve. So that's things like the remaining piece of the salary benefits review, that contingency fund, the engineering services for the community wells, the water program, and for the needs of consultants in planning and finance. And then there's also transfers from the wind energy reserve to fund items such as the council grants, and business retention and expansion, arts and culture strategy, agriculture day, South Shore Business Summit, Wake Up Hills surveys and appraisals, and then there's a small piece of that that's invested in the operating reserve.
Can I ask you just to remind me, because I'm sure I should know and remember, but Wake Up Hill survey and appraisals? $10,000, what's that for?
That's something under economic development.
I think that's related to the 20 acres of land.
Oh, right,
purchased
on the
by
Windsor Road
municipality.
there. Okay, oh, the business, oh, yeah, business part.
Business wall.
If that's the cost that we spent already.
Included that.
And the transfers to reserves, this is mostly reproduction of some data we've looked at earlier in the slides, with a little bit more of a breakdown of the operating reserve and how that's comprised of the landfill post fees and of the solid waste surplus and an allocation for elections, as well as the breakdown of the wind energy reserve contribution. So the component that comes from our net gain on the wind turbine, and the component of that comes from the property taxes assessed on that wind farm. All right, that gets us through the departmental sections, and we're into the home stretch here. Now we're going to go through some schedules and projections of some various rate setting and reserve balances, projections, that type of thing. So the first one here is the debt servicing charges over the next 5 years. And we have total, a reconciliation of total debt from the beginning of each year, the debt charges by principal and payment, and then the breakdown by program area. And then right at the bottom, we've included the financial condition indicator flag. So you can see that the budget for 23-24, we're budgeting 7.3% debt charges. However, that goes back, so it'll be a green flag, which is unusual for us in that one. And then it'll go back to red flags. This isn't a great indicator, in my opinion. Those debt servicing charges are, as you can see, almost entirely related to specific revenue generating assets, landfill, wind turbine, et cetera. And you can see that the years of 24, 25 through to 26, 27, we have a significant increase in debt servicing in the landfill, and that is to fund the current construction of cell 3B that is ongoing and expected to be completed within the next few months. Next, we have a 23-24 budgeted changes in reserves. So this is a kind of a detailed breakdown of the draws to and from reserve with opening balances and projected ending balances. Some highlights, so I guess you can see the forecasted opening balances total reserve balance is 29,299,892. There will be the addition of the general fund surplus for the year, which is expected at 1,160,000. The additions to reserve are just a repeat of some of the data you've seen already, as are the withdrawals, with the exception of the capital pieces. And so those are summarized down at the bottom here. So the capital expenditures from general operating, wind and gas tax. And if you wanted to, you could go and tie that to the capital budget where we clarify which pieces are being funded from reserve. Then interest allocation and the ending balances budgeted for March 2024. Where we're expecting to end the year at $27,155,969 in reserve. The following slide takes those ending balances and then projects them out for an additional 4 years. So we have a 5-year projection of reserve balances. You can see fluctuations year over year as we have planned expenditures and contributions.
Tim, I just want to ask a question on these projected balances. I'm looking at the gas tax and I don't know if you're taking any of that in consideration, and obviously EVs are coming on board. So, you know, our gas tax revenue probably will drop. They haven't really said how they're going to address that from the province yet, or I don't know.
Yeah, so for gas tax projections, we're projecting revenues to remain relatively consistent. That is an estimate, as you stated. There are a number of things that could change that contribution going forward. I think that clearly there needs to be some change in how that is funded, as we seem to be very quickly moving away from all gas-powered vehicles. Any suggestion as to what that might look like would be a wild speculation on my part.
I think actually it's, the gas tax was the original name for the program. It's been changed, I think, municipal.
And that's true. It's called the
That's just
Canadian Community Building Fund is what they call it now. And
I think it has been disconnected
Oh,
from that. I think that was the notion. So I have not heard anything. I don't know if you've heard anything. I haven't heard anything that it will track related to the gas tax collected. So it has changed its name and it's disconnected from that revenue stream.
Why don't we change the name to? Because it is confusing.
I can speak to that because it's consistency. So now that we've had this discussion openly, I think it makes more sense to start using the proper name for that going forward.
Yeah.
I think the concern was that there's be confusion as to what is this CCTF? And in some reports, I do include both. Yeah.
Like Prince.
Yeah.
so do you think that it'll be the same, you don't know what you can spend it on?
No, there's been no communication that has changed. So it's, I think it's with confidence that we've included it in the budget, and I think,
Okay.
yeah, I would say for the medium term, for sure. Yeah.
Okay,
Actually, on that page, can I ask about Forest Heights, under capital, obviously capital reserves, sorry, Bella,
That's okay.
sorry.
Okay.
I'll direct my voice to Abdullah, not you, Tim, no. What would that be consisting of, that figure or amount, and that is as a community school, and we have other community schools, maybe it's on the slides here somewhere, obviously, CDS, CAMS,
Yeah,
NRCS.
the projections for that one don't include anything other than a simple expectation of interest income on the balance. My understanding is that reserve has not really been active a whole lot. It just sort
no,
of
I
sits
can't
there.
remember the details, but that was set up like at the very beginning of time.
Yeah, it was created when Forest Heights
Yeah.
initially became a community
Cool.
school, and that's why you only see Forest Heights and none of the other schools. And so it was established in there, but we haven't actively accessed it as much. It's essentially just been gaining interest over time, and at some point in the future, if there was a capital project related to community use of that facility.
Yeah, it was part of the agreement that we established that, and that it only be used for certain things.
So it doesn't exist for any other
Yeah,
communities.
well, that was built as a community school, so therefore the agreement with the province would
Yeah.
be much hardier, I would think, versus the reassigning of our existing schools to community schools. Thank you.
The next page discusses or shows the details of the solid waste area rate. So you can see the revenues that are budgeted coming from interest on receivables, as well as primarily from waste collection area rate, that's the 2,678,000. The landfill revenues, as well as a small amount for recycling revenues. And then the expenditures broken down by program area. Similarly, waste collection, landfill, and recycling, with transfers to reserve being 988,000 in the coming year. That is the 200,000 to the landfill equipment reserve, plus the 788 that was broken down on the previous slide. The EDU charge on the next page for sewers. So here's a breakdown of, again, revenues and expenditures in the sewer program area. As mentioned previously, we're budgeting for a small surplus of $3,728, which would be seen as that contribution to reserve. And that is based on a 2% increase to the sewer, the universal sewer charge to $691.20. For the 5-year projection here, we've used an assumption of 2% growth in operating costs and a 1.5% increase in the EDU rate to show that that reserve would remain relatively consistent between about 1.5 and 1.8 million dollars over the next 5 years. Now, there are significant unknowns and changes that may occur due to some of the expansion. There has been a modest assumption of increased EDU count in this expectation. However, not anticipating significant changes to operating costs. The current plans for expansion that you saw in the capital budget are not funded through debt, and so there would be no impact to the EDU from that. And the assumption being that newly created areas would have a smaller operating charge. There will be some increases in cost to power for any lift stations, et cetera. So that's the expectation here. However, any further expansion will affect the EDU count and will impact the changes. And so this is something we'll be looking at very closely as we go through any changes and expansions and upgrades and all of that fun stuff. The development charge would also impact some of this stuff because that would be a contribution to the reserve, which then there'd be options to use that for whether it's what would be for funding the expansion, but that would have an indirect impact through requirements for debt financing, and that would have an impact on the operating costs. The next page here is the streetlights budget.
Dear, dear, my heart.
So this shows each of the different streetlight area rates that we have and the location of each of those, along with the assessed values, or in the case of the new lights in District 5, that's a property count because it's a per property charge rather than.
Non-completed streetlights in District 5. I just want to be clear.
And you can see the projected actuals in revenue and expense for this year, as well as the budgeted revenue and expense for next year, and the individual surplus or deficit for each of those area rates at each year end for this year and the following one. And then there are 4 different rates shown for each one. The first column would be the current 22-23 rate, and then some rates for comparison. So what would the rate be to cover exactly the annual expenditure budget? And what would be the rate if we were to cover the expenditure budget and clear 20% of the surplus or deficit in that year? The final column is a recommended rate, or the rates that have been used in building the budget for this year. I've highlighted 2 of them as recommended increases. One is in East Chester. As you can see, the the rate required to cover annual expenditures is nearly 4 times what the current rate is. I'm recommending increasing that by 2.2 cents in the current year, with an understanding that we would likely have to look at increasing that in the future if that trend were to continue, but without doing the full change all in the first year. And the other recommended change down at the bottom is to change the rate from 1.3 cents to 2 cents.
Well, cover the expenses.
That's one we had in the subdivision there, correct?
It's Haddon Hill. I'm not sure the exact area that covers.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, I think so.
Dan's territory.
Okay.
Well,
Dan, do you get that on your property tax bill?
Is that on your bill, Dan?
He's gonna check that out, I can see it.
Yeah, it must be.
But there is a subdivision there that had.
There
I think
is,
that-
up above, I don't think there are any streetlights.
Okay.
But it's fairly dark sky.
Okay,
We'll just go on that way.
well, it is,
Next is the
There's
Milco.
definitely some on that. Let's not have it.
It probably would be those ones, that's my guess.
yeah,
Yeah, the Milco hydrants, the rate is assumed to be staying flat at 28 cents. That is a recurring theme there. As you can see here, that rate does not cover the operating costs for that facility or for that service. However, the gap is closing as costs are expected to come down slightly this year, and with assessed values going up, the revenue has gone up. So, but you are going to be seeing more detail coming from the Public Works Department on options for how to deal with that.
We got some work
So
to do.
for now, the recommendation is to leave that rate flat and understand that there is a deficit that we're funding in there. This year, the deficit is just over $29,000.
So we're going to finance that deficit, but not the East Chester deficit for streetlights.
Well, that's a decision for council to make, I guess.
What was that, Derek, sorry?
Well, some deficits we are putting up the rate, and others we're not. So
Well,
I'm
I
looking
would
for
put
that
a
consistency.
Yeah, but what I would say is that both deficits are currently being funded.
Yeah.
By the municipalities,
But in one case,
and for the Milco, the intention is to come back to council with a solution to make that viable.
I'm just making a
And,
comment.
okay,
To see if we're gonna be doing funding deficits or not for streetlights, we should be doing the same for sewers, right? It should be consistent.
Well, so part of the difference there is the magnitude, right? So the rate for Mill Cove is 28 cents. Whereas the rate for, what was it, East Chester is 2.2 cents. And so we're recommending a change of 2.2 cents to that rate, whereas you can see the revenue for Mill Cove is 20,000. So we would need to more than double that rate to fund. And there are specific plans for assessing options for what to do with the Mill Cove hydrants. Whereas the streetlights are an ongoing thing, and as Dan
There's
mentioned,
legal obligations. and
the
things.
general rate is funding that deficit. Right.
There is an internal inconsistency in how we're treating. Just a comment.
Yep. Yeah, the streetlights are, a lot of different things going on there.
and they're all different for each area, how they're calculated, which sort of is another issue.
Well, what I think Tim's right, you're comparing apples to oranges. Just in the.
Wow. Yes, we are, but on a very high level, we're not. It's on a philosophical level, should we be funding deficits?
That's what I was trying to say. How can we make it so succinct?
I don't know, you're the lawyer.
You sit next to me.
I speak around it.
He's sitting next to me, that's why.
I'm like an engineer.
He feels fine. Okay, keep going. Sorry, this day's getting long.
All right, we're getting very close to the end here. So the next page is just the rates that have been used in building this budget. This in previous year would have been, hey, this is what you're approving. However, when we do come back for approval, it will be one of the first 2 pages of that budget book that you've got there. This is just a summary of what's been included in this year's budget.
This is your first look at where we are.
Yeah, it's really just the inputs that have been used to build everything that we've just gone through. And then we've got the parking lot items, so this would be unbudgeted potential expenditures. And that's just a list of various capital and or operating things that may or may not be incurred, but of course would require further discussion and approval if they were. Many of these would, if it came to me for recommendation, which it would, I would recommend reserve funding for a lot of these things, if and when we do
Because we
move
have
forward.
no clue what it all means.
Well, and because a lot of them would be one-time
One-time
items, right? They're not base ongoing funding. And then the last page here is the surplus. So we as municipality are required to budget our operating fund to zero every year. We do not budget deficits or surpluses. The budget that has been built and presented to you today includes a surplus, which is a total of $462,774. Now, these are some discussions that will need to happen over the next couple of weeks as to what council would like to do to ensure that we've got a balanced budget. I've presented a couple of information items for you here. So, for example, what would a tax rate reduction look like? A 1 cent reduction on the residential and resource rate would impact the budget by $195,403. Whereas conversely, a 1 cent reduction on the commercial rate would have an impact of $11,276. Some other options that you might want to consider would be increasing the allocation of deed transfer tax to reserve. As we are currently budgeting, it's half of the deed transfer tax is going to reserve and the other half is offsetting the general rate. And then, of course, I think there were some discussions about things to add to the budget earlier today, and there may be other items that you want to discuss to close that gap of $460,000.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I'm quite now, deliberate.
Well, it's time to have a bit of a discussion on things that we want, but I mean, I whatever.
Now, do we want to do the in-camera session before you begin your robust discussion, as Andre would call
Maybe we should.
it?
Yeah, that's probably.
Okay.
Motion to in camera, sorry.
Can I just ask a question, just kind of going forward, proceedings and timelines? And I know we're not there yet, but predicting that we might have a hard discussion or some things. And we committed for people that have appointments, leave here today at 1.
I know.
No, I'm just I'm remembering that from last week. And I think Derek is not able to be here next Thursday. I don't know, he just left, so I can't even ask him, right?
Yeah,
So in terms of looking ahead to the 23rd, if we are hoping to maybe approve the budget, which I don't, I mean, that may.
We better be, because I'm gonna change an important appointment to be here.
On the 23rd, okay, yeah, but I'm just thinking, I know that's not part of the discussion, but before we get into a hearty discussion, then we have to leave at 5 to 1 in a half. I'm just saying, should we
Well, we
come?
may have to have a special meeting.
I think so.
It's just the way it is.
I think that might be special.
Yeah.
So we'll find out for when.
Well, I mean, he has to be over here by 1 o'clock. Are we gonna settle all this by then? Absolutely not.
No.
It's important enough that we have to have a special meeting.
Yeah.
It's important. I mean,
Yeah, of
we can
course
make
it
a
is.
joke and say
That's
we
not a big
could
deal.
resolve it, but
I mean, and a lot of people, to be honest with you, I mean, we just went through this. There's a lot there. You
Yeah.
know, there's a lot there.
It's
Give
still
some thought
striving for
to.
the 23rd for approval.
Yeah.
It'd be nice.
So I mean, I think we do our in-camera piece, but
Okay.
then it's gonna be
So-
damn close to him time to leave, and that's just the way it is, and we're gonna have to set up special.
Motion to in camera.
Second.